Уважаемые друзья, тема моего выступления – ситуация на Донбассе. И ход...
Twongeye kubaha ikaze abanywanyi bacu bakunze bahembwa gukurikirana mu mpande zina z'isi ikaze muri ano makuru tugiye kubabwira amakuru ariko aravuga ku isi muri kano kanya. Muri aya makuru yacu tuza kwibanda ku ntambara ariko irahuza igihugu cya Ukraine n'igihugu cy'Uburusiya n'ukuntu intambara ishobora gutandukira isi yose ikaba intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose. Muri umwanya muke tugiye guca ku mayange ku biriko birabera mu burengerazuba bw'Uburayi neza mu karere ka Donbas. Twongeye kubaha ikaze abanywanyi bacu bakunze bahire muri kwikirana mu impande zina z'isi tubusaba kugira sabone cyangwa kugira subscribe aturabikora twibutsa ko channel ya mbere twahorana yagize ikibazo maze duhindura kuri channel nshasha aje gituma tubasaba kugira sabone kabona aho urabira amakuru kuri channel yawe hagisa n'agahama canke n'umutsuku ugire subscribe kugira ngo tubandanye dutera imbere hamwe. Murakoze rero tubandanye n'amakuru yacu. Amakuru yacu nkuko tugiye twabwiye tugiye kwibanda gusa ku nkuru iriko iravugwa cyane gose y'amatora ya kamarampaka canke amatora y'ibwizwa shingiro ariko araba mu karere ka Donbas region. Amatora akaba ariko araba mu duce tune tugize akarere ka Donbas region. Amatora akaba ariko arabera mu karere ka Luhansk na Donetsk Republican ndetse na Kisone ndetse na Zaporizhia. Aha hose rero hane akaba ariko arabera amatora tugize ku munsi wa gatatu amatora y'ibwizwa yo guhindura ibwizwa shingiro. Amatora akaba abanyagihugu bafise amahitamo abiri no kwemera ko buno burere bufatanwa n'Uburusiya canke guhakana. Niyo umunyagihugu wese atora ahabwa ikarata imwe gusa iriko aho ashirako ko yemeye canke ko ahakanye, ushirako akarongo k'akavi ko wemeye canke ugashirako udusaraba ko ahakanye. Ibi rero nivyo biriko biraba muri rero aya matora y'ibwizwa shingiro. Uburayi ndetse na Amerika bakaba yise ngo shame referendum canke amatora y'igikozasoni ku Burusiya. Aya matora rero akaba Uburayi na Amerika bararahiye bararengwa ko badashobora kwemera ibizoba byavuyemo uko byagenda byose. Ariko rero Uburusiya bwo bukamenyesha ko igihe amatora azorangira bagamara guharura bazohita bamenyesha ibyavuyemo, ndetse Uburusiya bukaba bwaramenyesheje ko buhita bwemera ibivuye muri aya matora ndetse bugashira mu ngiro ibizoba byavuye muri aya matora. Aho Uburusiya bwamenyesha ko buzokwemera decision y'abanyagihugu bo mu karere ka Donbas region nkuko twabwiye. Amatora ikora mu ntara zine zose. Amatora yakaba hagarariwe n'abatowe muri komisiyo z'amatora muri buno burere, ndetse akaba bifashwamo kandi n'abasirikare b'Abarusiyaho, ndetse abanyagihugu bamwe bamwe basangwa mu mazu iwabo akaba ariho batorera bazaniwe amakarata amasanduku y'amatora. Aho biboneka ko abayatwara amasanduku y'amatora ariko rimwe n'abasirikare b'Uburusiya, maze rero umunyagihugu agahitamwo kwitorera uko ashatse. Buri muryango umwe wese uhabwa ikarata imwe, nta muryango n'umwe yahabwa ikarata zibiri, maze rero bagahita batora. Kuvuga rero kuri aya masaha ntibiramenyeshwa ibyavuye muri aya matora ya kamarampaka ko amatora acabandanya, ndetse ariko ibice bimwe baza bamaze guharura ibyavuye muri aya matora. Turababwira rero impamvu tuvuze ko ibi bishobora gutera intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose, aho tugiye kurabira hamwe mu kanya amajambo yagiye aravugwa, yaba iryavuzwe na Perezida Zelensky ndetse n'iryavuzwe n'umushikiranganje wo kwivuna amaso w'Uburusiya Shoigu, ndetse n'iryavuzwe n'umushikiranganje w'imigenderanire n'ayandi makungu Lavrov mu nama mpuzamakungu ya ONU ya 77 ku munsi w'ejo, aho yariko defendinga canke aravugira Uburusiya Uburusiya kuba bwarahisemo gukoresha amatora y'ibwizwa shingiro muri tuya turere, ndetse aho Uburusiya bwo butemera ko ari nabwo buri korakoresha bwo ko araba leader canke abayobozi baburiya burere bahisemo gukoresha amatora y'ibwizwa shingiro. Reka mu kanya duce tugaruka kuri aya majambo atatu y'abategetsi bo muri kino gihugu cy'Uburusiya, ndetse tugaruka no ku ijambo rya Zelensky, aho rero kugira ngo duce ku mayange turabira hamwe impamvu tuvuga ko intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose yoba iri kwiramota. Ibi tuvuze twisunze ku kiganiro kirekire uyu nyene umushikiranganje wo kwivuna amaso umushikiranganje w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu Lavrov yagiranye n'abamenyesha makuru ejo ku rubikuru by'inama mpuzamakungu ya ONU. duhere rero ku ijambo rya Perezida Vladimir Putin w'Uburusiya. Perezida Vladimir Putin w'Uburusiya yavuze ko uko vyagenda kose Uburusiya burashobora kwemera gutsindwa mu ntambara ya Ukraine, aho rero Uburusiya buvuga ko bugomba gukoresha ubushobozi bwabo bwose kugira ngo bukingire abanyagihugu bo mu karere ka Donbas region, aho yavuga ko Uburusiya buriko burakingira ivyo yise ihonyabwoko ngo ryateguwe n'abanazi. Abanazi akaba hari Kiev ari abategetsi ba Kiev bayobowe na Perezida Zelensky. Uburusiya rero kamenyesha ko ngo ufise ubushobozi bwose bwo gukingira abanyagihugu, aho yabajijwe ngo niba abona ko intambara Uburusiya buzotsinda. Perezida Vladimir Putin yamenyesheje ko ngo intambara ngo nta ntambara turimo, ngo turiko turakora special operation, ngo kandi special operation iriko iragenda nkuko twavyifuza, ngo kandi nta nkeka ko special operation tuzoyisoza neza, ngo kuba turiko turagenza buke buke ngo no kugira ngo twirinde ko ngo igwamwo abantu benshi cyane gose, ngo ariko rero ngo kubwacu ngo abasirikare ngo bakomanda bari ku rugamba ngo ku makuru makuru akuva ku mashikiranganje wo kwivuna amazi ngo nta kintu na kimwe kiraba nabi, ngo byose biko biragenda neza nkuko twabiteguye. Inyuma y'ijambo rero niho Perezida nyene Vladimir Putin yamenyesheje ko ngo yisunze icegeranyo catanzwe n'umushikiranganje wo kwivuna amazi ndetse ngo n'abandi bagenerale ngo basavye ko Uburusiya guhamagaza abandi basirikare kugira ngo bafashanye na bene babo abari ku rugamba. Hakaba naje gituma Perezida Vladimir Putin yavuze ati nahise mfata ingingo yo gutegeka ko abasirikare ibihumbi amajana 3 ba reserve bazanwa bakaza gufashanya n'abandi, aho yavuze ko yahamagaje abasirikare basanzwe bafise ubunararibonye baba baramaze gukora igihe kirenga umwaka mu gisirikare cy'Uburusiya, ariko bakaba batari bakira abasirikare bashize mu basirikare ba reserve kuvo iyica nkindi rero akaba ari we yahamagaje. Aho rero hatubutse ko igisirikare cy'Uburusiya gifise abasirikare ba reserve bagera ku miliyoni 25, miliyoni 25 zose rero murumva ko Uburusiya burisha ko n'ingendo ngombwa bashobora guhamagaza n'abandi benshi barenzabo. Ibi rero amakunga amenyesha ko ibi biboneka ko by'ukuri Uburusiya bwiteguye gukora intambara ikomeye cyane rwose, ndetse intambara idashobora guhagarara vuba. Perezida Vladimir Putin nyene ngo yahise agendera ikindi kigo gikuru ca gisirikare gisanzwe gikora ibigwanisho, aho yavuze ko bakora ibigwanisho byiza ndetse ibigwanisho bigezweho. Akaba yanategetse ko kino kigo gihita gitanga ibigwanisho bimwe kugira ngo bize kuba birakora ku rugamba mu karere ka Kison ndetse no mu karere ka Zaporizhia, aho Uburusiya busanzwe ko buragwana intambara ikomeye cyane rwose hagati y'igisirikare ca Ukraine n'igisirikare c'Uburusiya. Abahanganye cyane rwose nubwo amatora yashikamaje nk'ibyo shingiro ariko arabandanya, ariko rero imigwano irakomeye muri tuno duce twa Kison ndetse na Zaporizhia, aho riboneka ko guhangana gukomeye nubwo amatora aba abasirikare bari ku rugamba bari nabo bakaba bari barafasha bari barakoresha amatora muri tuno turere. Rero Uburusiya bukavuga ko igihe amatora yoheza kuba maze ababa muri tuno turere bakemeza ko bagiye kujya ku Burusiya, Uburusiya buzohita buca umupaka ntarengwa bukingire tuno turere. Babwira impamvu uko rero umushikiranganji w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu w'Uburusiya yavuze ukuntu bazokingira tuno turere mu gihe tuno turere twokwemera kuba Uburusiya.
А сейчас пришло время и самой.
Tutarabwira ivyo mu bushikiranganje w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu, reka tugaruke ku ijambo ry'umushikiranganje wo kwivuna amazi Shoigu yavuze mu kiganiro nawe nyene yatanze kuri televiziyo nkuru y'igihugu c'Uburusiya. Umushikiranganje wo kwivuna amazi w'Uburusiya Shoigu yamenyesheje ko ku rugamba bifashe neza cyane, aho yarabajijwe ngo mubona ko urugamba ruze gute Omega. Yabajijwe ibibazo bishika nka bene aho yabajijwe ikibazo cya mbere, yabajijwe ukuntu urugamba bifashe maze anashaho urugamba bifashe neza. Amenyesheje abajijwe abasirikare bamaze gukira ku rugamba, yavuze abasirikare bashika kuri 5,439 ko ari bamaze kwasiga ubuzima. Akaba amenyesheje ko ku ruhande rwa Ukraine naho bamaze gupfisha abasirikare barenga 150 ndetse ngo n'abandi barenga 70 bakomerekeye ku rugamba ngo ni ku ruhande rwa Ukraine, aho avuga ko mu bitigire ngo bafise kubera ko ngo bafise satellite ziguma zigenzura ibintu byose. Akaba yamenyesheje ko ngo Uburayi ibigwanisho byinshi cyane gose bamaze kuzana muri Ukraine, Uburusiya bumaze kubiturira. Amenyesheje ko ngo ivyo berekana ku mateleviziyo babwira abanyagihugu ko ibyo bazana muri Ukraine ko ibyo bazana nk'akarere. Yamenyesheje ko hari amasatelite y'abasivili barenga ku 70 n'amasatelite agera ku 21 za gisirikare gisirikare zo mu bihugu by'Uburayi ziriko zirakorera muri Ukraine ibyo byose bamenyesheje ko ibihugu by'Uburayi butamenyesheje kubera ibi ari kurenga ku masezerano ku mategeko mpuzamakungu agenga intambara n'ibindi bihugu ndetse kurenga ku mategeko agenga ubwigenge bw'Uburusiya bakavuze ngo ariko ibyo byose ngo tubigenzura hafi ngo kandi nta na kimwe kiraba inyuma y'ubushobozi bwacu ibyo dushoboye gukontorora bakaba banavuze ko rero ngo nakanya gato tutaramenya ngo aho dushobora kwisanga Uburusiya buriko buhanganye n'igisirikare cy'anato ngo kandi turamaze gushira ngo ibishoboka byose ku rutonde kugira ngo hamwe inzira ko duhangana n'igisirikare cy'anato ngo twiteguye ngo nta kibazo abasirikare bacu bariteguye kandi abakomanda bose igisirikare cy'Uburusiya ngo barayoboka ngo ibyo shingiro by'Uburusiya ngo kandi bakayoboka kizigenza mukuru w'igisirikare cy'Uburusiya ariwe perezida Vladimir Putin. Turabandanya n'amakuru yacu rero tugiye kugaruka ku ijambo rirerire ryamaze hafi ikiganiro cyamaze isaha yose cy'umushikiranganji w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu Shoigu nako haravuga mu rutunga yagize mu nama mpuzamakungu ya ONU ariko ikiganiro yahaye abanditsi n'abamenyeshamakuru. Mu majambo rero hakaze cyane gose mu kiganiro umushikiranganji wo kwivuna amaso w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu nako Uburusiya Lavrov yahaye abanditsi n'abamenyeshamakuru mu bibazo yagira bazwa. Ikibazo ca mbere yabajijwe ngo by'ukuri ngo niba Uburusiya bwariyumviriye ku byo buriko burakora muri kariya karere hevye gukoreshwa ibwirizwa shingiro ngo n'impamvu babikoze kugira ngo buriya buce buje ku Burusiya. Ikino kibazo umushikiranganji w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu yacishuye ko ngo kuba amatora y'ibwirizwa shingiro ariko araba muri kariya karere ka Donbas region ngo nuko ngo abanyagihugu baho ngo na cyane igice cabo kinini bavuga ururimi rw'Uburusiya ngo kandi ngo mu 2014 ngo Perezida Zelensky ndetse ngo n'abafatanya kuyobora ngo akaba yavuze ko ngo abanyagihugu ngo ho muri kariya karere ka Donbas region ngo ururimi rwabo bavuga ngo ntabwo ari Kirusiya ngo kandi ngo kuba bavuga ngo ururimi rw'Ikirusiya ngo ntibibaha ngo kuba ngo abantu ngo bahambaye cyane gose ngo kurusha ngo abandi bantu basigaye ngo bose b'igihugu ca Ukraine. Aho ngo rero muri aya majambo ya Perezida Zelensky ngo harura ko ngo ari nko kwerekana ko igihugu ca Ukraine kidashaka bano banyagihugu bo muri kano karere kavuga ururimi rw'Ikirusiya. Aho yanavuze ko ngo bikorwa rero ngo byaci bikurikira ngo by'intwaro ya Kiev ngo byerekana ko ngo abanyagihugu bo muri kano karere bakumiriwe ndetse ngo hatangiye kuba n'imigwano y'abashigikiye Kiev ngo yo kwica bamwe mu bayobozi bo muri tuno turere. Birako ari navyo byatumye abayobozi bo muri tuno turere biyumvira ko bakwiye kwiyunga na bene wabo basanzwe bavuga Ikirusiya nabo akaba ari Abarusiya ngo ariko bikaba byaratevye ngo twagiye duhoyahoya kugira ngo tubabwira ko bidakenewe ngo ariko rero igihe kiza kugira ngo tubonye ko ibikorwa vya Kiev birengeye ibyo kwihanganira ngo maze rero duhitamo gufasha bano banyagihugu bari bageramiwe n'ihonyabwoko ry'abanazi kugira ngo bikukire ngo rero muri kino gihe kuba bariko barakora amatora y'akamampaka ngo ni uburenganzira bwabo ngo nk'abandi banyagihugu bose ku isi yose ngo ibi ngo atari igihugu ca mbere zo bibayemo ibindi bihugu byose byagiye bikorayo ngo ntabwo Uburusiya abona ko ari ikintu kidasanzwe kiko kirakorwa mu karere ka Donbas region. Ikindi kibazo kigira kabiri yabajijwe ngo none undi munyeshamakuru yabajije ngo turemera ko muriko murakoresha amatora y'ibwirizwa shingiro amatora yamirijwe n'Uburayi ndetse yamirizwa na Amerika ndetse Amerika ikaba inamenyesha ko ihita ifata ibihano bikomeye cyane gose ngo mu gihe amatora yo kwemezwa ibyo yavuyemo ngo maze mukabishikira. Umushikiranganji wo kwivuna amaso yahise amenyesha ko kuba Amerika itemera iby'ibwirizwa shingiro ariko riratorwa muri cyo yavuze ati icyo ni kibazo cyabo ati uburengerazuba bw'isi ufise igihe cyose ko ubona ibintu na cyane ko ngo ariko uri kora ibigwanisho kive kugira ngo ihonye abanyagihugu babyo ngo birero ntibitangaje ngo turazi aho Amerika ihagaze n'Uburayi aho hagaze muri rusangi ngo birero ngo ni hitamo y'abanyagihugu bakarere ka Donbas region ngo nta numwe wundi muntu numwe wese afise ubushobozi bwo kubahitiramo uko bagomba kubaho ngo yaba Amerika canke y'Uburayi ngo canke yaba n'Uburusiya ngo ko Uburusiya buzokwemera intahe yaho bashize bano banyagihugu aho amatora azorangira guherera. Ikibazo kigira gatatu yabajijwe ngo none amatora harabaye yego ibivuye mu matora biremeje abanyagihugu bo muri kano karere batoye bemeje ko babaye bemeye kubana ko tuno turere atubaye mu Burusiya buzoca bukora iki igikurikira ngo mbega Uburusiya bwa ofisi umugambi wo guca bwimura ibigwanisho vya nucleaire bukabizana muri tuno turere ndetse ngo Uburusiya bwo wabufise bushaka guhita burinda tuno turere nkuko ubutaka bw'Uburusiya burinzwe ngo mwoba mwitegura gukoresha ubumara bwa nucleaire kurinda buno ubutaka. Umushikiranganje wo kwivuna w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu Lavrov yahise yishura kino kibazo ati muri provision zacu zo gukoresha ibigwanisho vya nucleaire birazwi uko bigenda ngo ntabwo rero twebwe ngo dufise imigambi yo gukoresha ivyo bigwanisho vya nucleaire ariko niba muri provision zacu zo ko ibigwanisho vya nucleaire bikora ngo ho bahageze ko bikora mu byukuri ngo nta ubizi ngo ivyo bizokwirwa ko nta bisanzwe bijejwe ngo ariko rero ngo ivyo sivyo turimo ngo ivyo kuvuga ko rero ngo Uburusiya buhita burinda tuno turere nkuko ubutaka bw'Uburusiya burinzwe ngo ivyo no kuri ngo nta gukekeranya kurimo mu Burusiya bufise ubushobozi ngo ubutaka bw'Uburusiya bwose burinzwe ngo n'imigwi ine canke na provision zine aha naho rero yashatse kuvuga abasirikare bagwanira hasi n'abasirikare bagwanira mu kirere ndetse n'abasirikare bagwanira mu mazi n'abasirikare bakoresha ibigwanisho vy'umara bwa nucleaire ngo imigwi ine rero yose niyirinze ubutaka bw'Uburusiya nibi rero bizoca biba appliqué kuri buno butaka bwa Donbas region mu gihe buno butaka bwa Donbas region buzoba bumaze gutora amatora bukemeza ko abubaye ubutaka bw'Uburusiya. Uburusiya bwonyene buzoba bufise ubushobozi bwo guhita burinda buno butaka nkuko ubutaka bw'Uburusiya bundi burinzwe nkuko yavuze ngo ni nkuko Crimea irinzwe ngo niko buno butaka nabwo buzohita burindwa n'uvuga rero ko ibi yabimenyesheje atajya mu mwaka rero bivuga ko nubwo atavuze ko ivyo mabombe ya nucleaire n'ibindi ariko yavuze ko ngo igihugu c'Urusiya aho ubutaka bwose bw'Urusiya burinzwe n'amaprovision ane aha rero navyo bizohita biba appliqué kuri buno ubutaka igihe bwo bano banyagihugu bo muri kano kare bari kwagira amatora y'ibwizwa shingiro bemeza ko bagiye kuba abanyagihugu b'Uburusiya rero ibi nivyo bizoca bikurikira ibi navyo rero bishobora rero arivyo bishaka kubyara intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose kuko mu gihe buno butaka rero bwoba ubutaka bw'Uburusiya maze rero Uburusiya bugahita bwimura rero ibigwanisho byose vya nucleaire n'ayandi mamisire abamisire hagera hatera ballistic missile canke izindi misile zose zirenze butaka bw'Uburusiya ibi rero bizotuma ko Uburusiya bushobora gutera ikindi gihugu cyose coba kiriko kirafasha igihugu ca Ukraine gutera ubutaka bw'Uburusiya. Tubandanije rero hano makunye tukibasigurira ibya bino ico bino bivuga kuba Uburusiya buzohita burinda buno butaka nk'ubutaka bwabwo no kuvuga ko rero ubutaka bw'Uburusiya nkuko twabwiye ko burinzwe na provision zine rero buno butaka buzohitwa bwimurirwa ko ibigwanisho bya nucleaire ivyo bisanzwe bitemewe n'amategeko muri kino gihe kubera buno butaka atari ubutaka bw'Uburusiya. Uburusiya nifise ubushobozi bwo kujanayo ama misile ya nucleaire ariko mu gihe buno butaka buzoba bwemeye ko ubutaka bw'Uburusiya buzoba bufise ubushobozi bwose bwo kujana ibigwanisho ivyo byose ndetse n'ama misile yambuka imbibe Uburusiya buzohita buyajana muri kano karere. Ibi rero akaba hari tuca tugaruka ku kibazo kigira kane cabajijwe uyu mushikiranganje w'imigenderanire n'andi makungu Lavrov. Ikibazo yirakane yabajijwe ati none ko Amerika yamenyesheje ko hamwe mu kwimurira ibigwanisho by'umara bwa nucleaire muri tuno turere ndetse n'ibindi n'andi bamisire yambuka imbibe ko Amerika ishobora guhita itera muri tuno turere ati ibyo zo mwavuze kwi Lavrov yavuze ati ibyo ntavyo tuzi ibyo wajije ntavyo turamenya ko niba Amerika yavuze gutyo ariko rero niba Amerika ibyo ari byo yobishaka ati ibyo n'ikindi kibazo cy'umutekano c'abajeje umutekano ati igihugu cy'Uburusiya kirakingiwe kirafise uko gicunzwe ati kandi such a threat canke ibintu byose bivuye intambara yose yoba ivuye hanze y'igihugu cacu abantu uwari wese utera ubutaka bwacu bw'Uburusiya ati Uburusiya burafise ubushobozi bwo kwivuna uwari wese ndetse yaba Amerika yaba nande ati uwari wese Uburusiya burafise ubwo bushobozi bwo kumwivuna. Rero niba Amerika iyo bayifise umugambi nubwo tutarabyumva tutarabimenya ati izohura n'abahandi kandi bashobora kwishura kuko igihugu c'Uburusiya kirarinzwe ati kandi igihe cyose Uburusiya ufise ubushobozi bwo kurinda ubutaka bwabwo n'ubusugire bwabwo atawe burinze gusaba uruhusha canke burinze kubaza ibiraka bivuze mu majambo akarishe avuga biboneka ko Uburusiya bwiteguye ko ari wese azotera muri tuno turere mu gihe tuno turere twoba ku Burusiya ndetse bikaba binashobora kuba ibintu bikomeye cyane gose kuko na Ukraine ubwayo kuzosubira gutera muri tuno turere tumaze kuba uturere tw'Uburusiya buzoharwa ko buriko buraterwa ku butaka bwabwo aha rero ariho bushobora gukoresha n'ibindi bigwanisho bikomeye cyane gose abamisire Uburusiya butarigera bukoresha muri intambara ibiro bikaba bishobora guhita bivyara intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose ayo tuvuga ko intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose iri hafi ndetse abantu dukwiye kuba tubirabira hafi cyane gose hamwe atacokorwa ndetse hamwe bahinga bavuga ko hamwe NATO itosubiza inyuma ivyo iri kwirakora yaba gufasha igihugu ca Ukraine ngo igarure ahubwo irabikuna inzira y'amahoro biboneka ko intambara ya gatatu atankeka iba mu bibazo vyagiye bizwa n'abamenyesha makuru biboneka ko bagiye berekana ko bafise amakenga ko Uburusiya bushobora gutanguza intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose na cyane cyane aho Uburusiya buvuga ko bwagiriza ibihugu vya Amerika n'ibihugu vya n'ibihugu vy'Uburayi ko vyarenze amasezerano abiha uburenganzira bwo gufasha ibindi bihugu biri mu ntambara aho rero ngo Amerika yazanye misile muri Ukraine atemerewe kuja mu kindi gihugu yemerewe gukoreshwa n'igihugu conyene ca Amerika mu gihe kiri mu ntambara n'ikindi gihugu aho rero bivuga ko ibi byose babiraba ndetse ko babagiriza na Amerika kuba yarazanye amasatelite ya gisirikare ngo arenga 70 yose mu gihugu ca Ukraine amasatelite yose rero bivuga ko ibi byose ari kurenga ku mategeko agenga ubusugire bw'igihugu c'Uburusiya ku mategeko yose ku masezerano yose babasenyeneye n'igihugu c'Uburusiya rero bakavuga ati ibyo byose tubirabira hafi kuko turabibona ati ibyo bamenyesha ibyo babwira amakungu n'ibyo bariko barakora hamwe kino gihugu ati sivyo na gatoya bakora ibi bakerekana ibi ati nkuko bamye ariko rero ati nta kibuza Uburusiya buriteguye guhangana n'iki kibazo icyo cyose covuka mu gihe abanyagihugu bo muri tuno turere bazo bamaze kwemera ko bagiye ku butaka bw'Uburusiya ati Uburusiya buzokubahiriza ibyo abanyagihugu bazo bashitseko ati kandi Uburusiya buriteguye kubakingira kwiguzi icyo cyose n'amajambo rero amwe hakomeye cyane gose yagiye avugwa n'uyu umushikiranganje wo kwivura basi reka tuce tubashirako igice kende cyano jambo abumva ururimi rw'icongereza murashobora kwandanya hamwe bikurikirana mukavyumva na hari twebwe turangirije makuru gira ico bivuga ko nibazo kurubona ko Uburusiya bushobora guteza intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose muri commentaire ariko ibiboneka nuko Uburusiya bwiteguye guteza intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose mu gihe atacokorwa kuko Uburusiya iboneka ko igihe buzamaze gufata kano karere bukagira karere ku Rusiya ibindi bitero byose bizokorwa muri kano karere bizoboneka ko ari bitero direct bitewe ku gihugu c'Urusiya ibi navyo bikaba bashobora guhita batera ndetse no mu bihugu bigize banato hari abantu benshi rero bavuga ngo Uburusiya nta bushobozi bufise bwo gutera ibihugu vya NATO ngo aravyuko intambara iri kwiragenda muri Ukraine twagomba tubabwire nk'abamenyesha makuru bakurikirana uko intambara iri kwiragenda muri Ukraine ko umuntu wese yavuga ko Uburusiya budafise ubushobozi bwo gutera ibihugu vya NATO ndetse no gutera muri Amerika ari kwibesha cyane gose gukomeye kuko Uburusiya burafise amamisile menshi cyane gose akomeye cyane gose butarakoresha mu ntambara yo muri Ukraine ndetse amamisile hari nk'amamisile yitwa Avad missile yo mu bwoko bwa tsunami ishobora guterwa igasambura igisagara cyose iziye Uburusiya ntabwo burigera buzikoresha mu gihugu ca Ukraine ushobora kugenda ukigirira research yawe canke ubushakashatsi bwawe ukaraba ibindi bigwanisho bikomeye cyane gose Uburusiya ufise utarakoresha mu gihugu ca Ukraine bushobora gukoresha mu gihe bwo buri ko buragwana n'ibindi bihugu nk'Uburayi rero Uburusiya burafise ubushobozi turavyemera bwo gutera ibihugu vya NATO kandi intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose Uburusiya burafise ubushobozi bwo kwitambuza nubwo atawuzi uwo itsinda canke uwo irangiza ariko rero ibi abahinga n'abashakashatsi basesanguzi mu by'intambara baravuga ko atawofinata ku gihugu c'Uburusiya igihugu c'Uburusiya gifise ubushobozi bwo kuba cokora intambara ikomeye cyane gose intambara yoba intambara ya gatatu y'isi yose rero nico gituma ubona no mu bigenda birakogwa yaba no mu nama mpuzamakungu bagenda bitonda badapfa ivyo bahurudutse gukora kubera bazi ubushobozi bw'Uburusiya buracahari ikindi kerekana ko ubushobozi bw'Uburusiya bufise ubushobozi bukomeye cyane gose ni kuvuga ko nk'uko vyamenyeshejwe na Perezida Biden mu nama mpuzamakungu ya ONU, yamenyesheje ko ngo igihugu ca Amerika kiriko kirafashanya n'ibindi bihugu bishika 41 mu kuba biriko birashigikira igihugu ca Ukraine. Uca ushobora kwibaza rero ushize mu bwenge bwa kuba Uburusiya buhanganye n'ibihugu bishika 42, ibihugu vya mbere rutura kw'isi bifise ibigwanisho vy'ubwoko bwose, kandi ibigwanisho byose nka byose bikomeye bafise muri bino bihugu bakaba barabizanye muri Ukraine, ariko bakaba batarashobora kwirukana Uburusiya muri Ukraine. Ucubona rero uca usubira ukiyumvira, ntubone bijya ubona ngo Uburusiya ntiburafata, wiyumviriye Uburusiya intambara buriko buragwana na bino bihugu vy'Uburayi ndetse n'igihugu ca Amerika. Niho ucubona rero ubushobozi bw'Uburusiya aho bugarukiye. Nta kindi gihugu kw'isi kiriho gishobora kuba cuba carahanganye n'ibihugu bingana nk'uko kose muri kino gihe kikaba kitaratsindwa, ariko ubona ko Uburusiya n'ubu bukifise ubuce bwose bwafashe muri kano karere ka Dombos region, malgré nuko bino bihugu vyose ubona ko vyashize mw'inguvu nyinshi cane gose, ndetse miliyaridi zirenga 25 z'amadolari y'Abanyamerika ku ruhande rw'Amerika zimaze gukora, n'imiliyaridi zirenga 10 ku ruhande rw'Uburayi zimaze gukora z'amadolari y'Abanyamerika. Urumva amahera yose amaze gukora ku bigwanisho maze kugenda bigwanya byose bino bigwanisho bigwanya abasirikare b'Uburusiya, ariko abasirikare b'Uburusiya bakaba bagifise aho bafashe muri Ukraine. Ibi ni cerekana ariko Uburusiya atawo busuzugura ngo ntibushobora guteza intambara y'isi yose, ndetse kandi bukanayigwana igakomera cyane rwose. Nk'uko twabwiye mu gisirikare cy'Uburusiya, igisirikare cy'Uburusiya gisanzwe kigizwe n'abasirikare barenga ku miliyoni n'ibihumbi 500. Abasirikare ba reserve nabo bakaba bagera ku miliyoni 25, bakaba bahamagaje abasirikare bagera ku bihumbi 300. Urumva rero ko ubushobozi bw'Uburusiya ari burebure cyane rwose ugereranije nuko abantu basanzwe batangwe muri bino minsi bavuga ko igisirikare cy'Uburusiya kiri wiki kidashoboye, ariko rero abandi abasesanguzi bavuga ko atawo vuga ko igisirikare cy'Uburusiya kidashoboye, kuko atakindi gihugu na kimwe kiboneka ko coshobora guhangana n'ibihugu vya Buraya ku rugero nk'uko Uburusiya bwashoboye guhangana na bino bihugu vya Buraya muri Ukraine. Na rero duce turangiza hano makuru ugire cyo bivuze ko niba uvuze ko ubona nawe ko Uburusiya budashoboye kubandanya buko ino ntambara, Uburusiya bwatsinzwe canke Uburusiya habushoboye uganije nuko wagiye urakurikira ino ntambara muri Ukraine. Ino ntambara rero ibonaka nuko atanisinye na ntoya guhagarara ifise mu gihe ataco kugwa. Mwakoze rero mugire vyiza, ariko tubutsa kugira sabone canke kugira subscribe tukaba utarabikora turagusavye ntaco bigutwara nta na kimwe kuri wewe, ariko kuri twebwe ni vyiza cyane gose kuko iyi channel yacu bituma itera imbere. Mwakoze rero mwese mugire ibihe vyiza.
Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, and we start with the questions. Yes.
I don't wish to provide opening remarks. I just spoke at the General Assembly. I set out our position. However, I would like just in pursuit to comment on some of the statements that just today have been heard from Washington, London, Brussels, and other Western capitals with respect to the referenda, which in these days are to be carried out in the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, and the liberated territories of Kherson and Zaporozhye Oblast in Ukraine. The hysteria which we have seen is very telling. A direct expression of the popular will of citizens has long ceased to be a form of establishment of control over a territory which the West has embraced and supported. However, once again, I do wish to draw attention to something I have said already when in August of 2021, Mr. Zelensky, in one of the interviews, vociferously proclaimed that in the east of Ukraine, there are not even people, but specimens. If somebody or entities, and if somebody in Ukraine, any of the residents of Ukraine feel Russian, wishes to speak in the Russian language, then for the sake of the future of their children and their grandchildren, he would recommend that those people leave, go to Russia. So, if you will, he launched the process that made the existence of ethnic Russians in Ukraine intolerable, and ultimately resulted in the fact that on the territories of these oblasts, republics, referenda were announced on unification with the Russian Federation. As was said by President Putin, we will unconditionally respect the results of these democratic processes. Now, turning to questions.
UN Correspondent Association, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mr. Minister, on behalf of the UN Correspondent Association for this press conference. Valeria Robeco from ANSA News Web Service. My question is, when the referendum are completed, will Moscow consider the areas that are controlled by Ukraine as occupied territories? Thank you.
Референдумы.
The referenda are being conducted on the basis of the decisions of the local government authorities. The conditions of those referenda have been published, and following those referenda, as I already said, Russia, of course, will respect the expression of the will of those people who, for many long years, have been suffering from the abuses of the neo-Nazi regime.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you, Foreign Minister, for answering our questions. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News. Would you clarify your government's position on the use of nuclear weapons, since President Putin's comments on the use of everything in our disposal has led to a lot of interpretation? And would that defense be applicable to the new territories that may be incorporated into Russia after the referendum? Thank you.
I wish to recall the following. It is very trendy now to use what is called cancel culture, to turn to cancel culture and to embrace it. This is actively being used by our Western colleagues, not just with respect to certain countries, certain politicians, but also it is being used with respect to historical events. The same way as in 2014, for example, all of our Western colleagues told us, look, we cannot accept annexation of Crimea. Why did you do this? And we tell them, think back. Why don't you remember what this all began with? There was a coup. There was a huge number of people who were killed. The putschists, having torn up the guarantees of Germany, France, and Poland, seized the administrative buildings. They began to pursue physically. They followed and ran after the president, the then president. They wished to seize him. And the first statement of the putschists were demands to cancel the regional status of the Russian language. There were demands for Russians to leave Crimea. In Crimea, for the storm of the parliament of the peninsula, armed groups of people were deployed, and only then the Crimean people reacted with a referendum in the eastern oblast of Ukraine, responded with a refusal to recognize the results of the coup. But all of these events are something Western colleagues begin to analyze with what happened in Crimea, when there was no other option other than to support the sincere expression of will of Crimeans, 95% of whom voted categorically in favor of returning to reunification with Russia, where they resided for centuries. The same with cancel culture. This has been seen in today's narrative, which has been unspooled regarding the question of nuclear weapons. Nobody remembers that in January, nobody mentions in January of this year, Zelensky, long before the launch of the special military operation, Zelensky announced in one of his statements, he spoke at length and continues to do so, saying that there was a great error for Ukraine to abandon nuclear weapons when the Soviet Union was collapsing. This issue was pushed in by him into a discussion with respect to how to resolve issues arising in Ukraine after the beginning of the special military operation. The then Minister for Foreign Affairs of France, Mr. Le Drian, also proclaimed that the Russian Federation needs to remember that France, too, has its nuclear weapons. This was unprovoked, and for this issue was not uttered by us at all. Zelensky began to exploit this, to use this. Le Drian also said that there are nuclear weapons in France, and you all are aware of Madame Truss's comments in response to the question of the correspondent of whether it would be scary for her to press the nuclear button. As for the Russian Federation, and I spoke about this was spoken about by the president and other representatives of the Kremlin, we have a doctrine for nuclear security, which is an open document. Everything is set out clearly there. I would invite you to take another look at what is explicitly set out instances where nuclear weapon use by us is acceptable.
Good afternoon. This is your special correspondent. You spoke at the UN Security Council meeting. There were open calls by Western countries, the participants in which. Does this mean that you see them as a potential opponent? And how does this change the structure of relations with those countries? We heard that there are, for the time being, no plans to send forces in. And the second question is, you referred to the doctrine. If the referenda on unification with Russia are successfully conducted, would Russia have grounds for using nuclear weapons in accordance with that doctrine if there are attacks on those territories? The United States says that in that case, Russia would have an unavoidable strike. So serious. How serious does Russia take those threats, and does this transform the conflict in Ukraine into a third world war, as Alexander Vucic has said? Well, I would not here try to make any gloomy forecasts. The entire territory of the Russian Federation, which is enshrined and could be further enshrined in the constitution of the Russian Federation, unquestionably is under the full protection of the state. That is absolutely natural. And all of the laws, doctrines, concepts, and strategies of the Russian Federation apply to all of its territory. I haven't heard that the United States is already threatening strikes. I heard that President Biden said that if the referendum were conducted and their results were adopted, Russia would face some additional sanctions. If there is this idea that Russia will inevitably face a strike, then I will look at that text, but I am not familiar with the United States and Ukraine already being allies who are bound by such a dangerous chain. As for the legal aspects of the West's participation in this war, well, even people who are only slightly following the situation will see what is happening. Ukraine is being flooded with weapons. Zelensky each day demands weapons from Germany or from Israel, criticizes Israel for not providing weapons in the quantities that Ukraine is asking for, or saying that they are not enough. And intelligence information is being provided. Satellite data is being provided. The group that is using the West to support the nationalist battalions and the Ukrainian armed forces is made up of around 70 military satellites and around 100 private company satellites. One of the commanders of the armed forces of Ukraine a while ago, commenting on the use of American weapons on the battlefield, said, yes, the Americans have the right of veto over the targets that we are choosing. What is that then, if not direct involvement in the use of lethal weapons and participation in war? And if we look at the legal side of things, the Americans, NATO and the European Union say that they are not a party to the conflict. If that's true, then there are conventions that apply. The Hague Convention in 1907, which is still in force, no one has repealed it. It pertains to the obligations of neutral powers in a naval war, and another one concerns a ground war. Those conventions stipulate that it's not just a self-declared neutral state, such as Switzerland, that is covered by the term neutral, but rather neutral states are considered to be any state that is not a party to an armed conflict. And I would once again recall that neither the United States nor Europe have declared themselves to be parties in what is happening in Ukraine. And if that's the case, then Article 6 of this Maritime Convention directly prohibits the supply by neutral states, those not participating in the conflict, of naval ships, munitions, and any military hardware to any of the belligerent parties. So in supplying weapons to Kiev, the United States and the European Union and NATO cannot claim to have neutral status. They cannot assert that they are not participating in the conflict. Moreover, one of those conventions, I believe the Ground War Convention, prohibits directly the establishing of recruitment points on the territory of neutral states, and you all know how the Ukrainian embassy and the consulate generals in Europe and in other countries are openly on their websites publishing invitations to join in the holy war against Russia. That is to say, they are engaged in direct mercantile activities, mercenary activities. In so doing, the Western countries that have allowed this to happen on their territory are also violating the Convention on Neutral Countries, and in so doing have proven that they are not observers, but rather are direct participants in the conflict. And one of the articles of this convention prohibits the use of telecommunications for military purposes. And as I already said, several dozen private satellites are being directly used in this war by Western governments, of course. And Starlink, a company that has satellites and ground-based infrastructure, they are using this resource, and that also indicates that the United States is by no means neutral in this situation and is a party to the conflict.
In electric blue, yeah.
Yes, electric blue.
You mean you know all of them?
I know all the colors, you know. Please take a mic.
No, you put the mic under the mask. You know?
Okay, now I am Maren Schmickler with German television, ARD. Thank you very much. Mr. Foreign Minister, could you please explain why so many Russians are leaving the country?
In Germany, have you not ratified the Convention of the Council of Europe on the rights of persons, which has freedom of movement?
Minister, thank you. Sherwin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. A joint communique that was issued this week after your BRICS ministerial on Thursday says the following. The ministers reiterated their commitment to multilateralism through upholding international law, including the purposes and principles enshrined in the UN Charter as its indispensable cornerstone, and to the central role of the UN in an international system in which sovereign states cooperate to maintain peace and security and advance sustainable development. Why, sir, have you signed on to a communique that so obviously contradicts the Russian Federation's actions on the ground as it relates to Ukraine? And you've also just said in the UN General Assembly that you support Brazil and India's permanent status in the UN Security Council. Why did you not mention South Africa? Thank you.
Can you tell me what exactly from the
paragraph 4 of the communique,
from the language what exactly from this language you believe contradicts our behavior?
I'll quote the Secretary General. He says that any annexation of a state's territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force...
No, you're quoting Secretary General.
Yes, but...
I can only be responsible for what I subscribe to, and this
You have said that you are you have signed up to the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The
Sure.
Secretary General says you have not. And your actions
well,
on the ground in
the
Ukraine...
Secretary General says many things in this regard, and he is commenting the situation around Ukraine on almost a daily basis, while I have not, I don't remember that he was active enough to promote the Minsk Agreement's implementation. I will explain to the principles of the United Nations Charter provide for respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. At the same time, they provide for respect for the right of people for self-determination. And the apparent conflict between these two concepts has been subject to many negotiations quite a long time. Soon after the United Nations was established, a process was started to develop the understanding of all the principles of the Charter.
And in 1970, in the year 1970, by consensus, a declaration of the General Assembly was adopted on the principles of relations amongst states in line with the Charter of the United Nations, which had a separate section, the right of nations to self-determination. There was a separate section on territorial integrity. And so the conclusion that the General Assembly arrived at vis-a-vis the interpretation of the Charter of the United Nations is as follows. All states have an obligation to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of any states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples and whose governments represent all peoples residing on their territory. If somebody is to tell me now that after the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, after the prohibition on the Russian language, Russian education, Russian media outlets, after the putschists for many long years continued to bombard the territory whose population refused to recognize the results of the coup, if after all of this somebody dares to tell me that the clique which is sitting in Kiev, the neo-Nazi regime seated there, pushing Nazi theory and practice in the legislation, that this regime represents the interests of the people in the east of Ukraine, I would probably simply smile, because for any impartial observer, it is absolutely clear that this regime completely fails to represent those people who feel themselves to be the bearers of the Russian language and the Russian culture. Everything is Russian. Where a quote? If you wish to, I quoted, if you wish to be Russian, then leave. Is this representation of the interests of the people? Of course, the Secretary General has the right to make statements. This is his statement, and I signed on to what was approved at the ministerial meeting of BRICS. Indeed, there is a paragraph where we set out the fact that ministers took note of the approaches to the situation in Ukraine, which each country sets out in the relevant fora, including at the Security Council and the General Assembly of the United Nations, that is honest. Nobody says in unison. Everybody has different views. There are nuances. We simply took note with respect. Those of us, the five, what we say at the international stage. You see, about, again, cancel culture, you didn't quote me in full. I said that we view India and Brazil as strong candidates, given they are leading international players, as strong candidates for permanent membership of the Security Council, with the condition that at the same time, in the same way, the profile of Africa will be raised. I mentioned India and Brazil for a single reason. They have long officially advanced their candidatures. As for South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, this step has not been put forward, and African countries, members of the African Union, are committed to the Eswatini consensus that was arrived at many years ago, and this is their collective position. However, addressing the question of expansion of the Security Council without meeting, reflecting the interests of Africans is not possible. Again, I emphasize that we are talking exclusively about expansion of the Security Council membership with the representatives of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Because if we are to talk about an additional inclusion in the Security Council of Western countries, well, that would be humorous for a number of reasons. I will set aside the fact that they are all hostile, and the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China to the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China. But if we set aside political assessments, most importantly, any Western country, what will it provide that is new to the Security Council, to the table? Nothing, absolutely nothing. They cannot provide absolutely nothing. They are all following the orders of the United States, Germany and Japan, who also announced their official candidatures. Just read what they are saying, what they are doing. And now, even if we step away from political assessments, setting them aside at the present moment, of the 15 members of the Security Council, 6 represent the Western group. Next year, there will be 7 because Japan will be added, whose policy, of course, is not an iota different from that of the United States.
Good afternoon, Leah Petrenko from RT Television. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. Sergei Viktorovich, I have a question about a situation that might not be directly related, but I would like to draw a parallel. On the one hand, there's the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who essentially is openly threatening Italy with consequences if the outcome of the elections in this country is not agreeable to Brussels. And then on the other hand, there are the referenda in Donbass, where when they were declared, almost immediately, European and American politicians said that they were unacceptable and began to compete with describing them in unfavorable terms. What is this approach to votes from the people, and how does one react to that? It's high-handedness, it's arrogance, it's all-powerfulness, this feeling of being all-powerful and a sense of one's own exceptionality, exclusivity, in that they are the only ones who have a right to judge. What Ursula von der Leyen said about the Italian elections was extremely high-handed, because such threats is something I do not recall any EU leader making in the past. But in principle, the European Union is becoming an authoritarian, harsh, dictatorial entity. This is no secret. Everybody is already well aware of this. But each year, on the margins of the General Assembly, we have many bilateral meetings. And this year, as in previous years, there was a planned meeting with the President of Cyprus, Mr. Anastasiades. Upon his request, we included him in the schedule at a time that was convenient to him. That schedule was published, both on our side and the Cypriot side. An hour before we were supposed to meet, Mr. Anastasiades' protocol informed our protocol that the European Union was not allowing him to do this meeting. Quite literally, that's what they said. That's no secret, because Mr. Anastasiades' office in Nicosia on the same day made a statement saying that the meeting had been cancelled due to the need to adhere to a European Union regulation of some sort. 2 further countries from the European Union and 1 NATO member country also wanted to have a meeting with me. They asked for that meeting to take place behind closed doors, for it not to be reported. I said, sure, however you like it. We're never going to say no to contacts, and we'll always be ready to accept a format that is comfortable for our partners. Having got that reaction, they suddenly fell off the radar. We didn't hear any more from them. So that's the way things are. When President Macron spoke, and I've even brought a quote with me here, he said that this is not the time for war. The time is not for revenge on the West or pitting the West against the East. But we never pitted the West against the East. The West simply decided that it didn't want to cooperate with us. And then he said, the time is one of our sovereign independent states to together deal with the challenges that we are facing. These are excellent words. But as an illustration of this, the permanent member of the Security Council in New York, and the capital, established a rotation for coordinating members among the P5. From the 1st of January, for 3 months, one country coordinates the actions, and then that coordination role goes on to another country. Now, in September, Russia is the coordinator among the permanent members of the Security Council. And each time the General Assembly takes place, that respective coordinator, whose country is at that time the coordinator, holds a meeting of the ministers of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council together with the Secretary General. As polite people, we also extended such a proposal. We got the agreement of the Chinese side, but the Anglo-Saxons informed us that they were not intending to engage with us. So you can judge for yourselves. When the West says, let's mediate, we'll mediate, and someone comes up with that idea, or why is it that you don't want to have any contacts with us? We've never stepped away from contacts. Everything has been destroyed and continues to be destroyed by Washington and London instantly, more and more actively, as well as Brussels and the European Union. And on the subject of the referenda, well, double standards, as you said. You'll remember how the West established an exception from international rules for Kosovo, but then the International Court of Justice said that there was no such exception at all. And then, in principle, after Kosovo, it was declared that any part of the territory of any country has the right to determine their own future without the consent of the central authorities. It's double standards. Where they're advantageous, they'll do what they want, and when they're not, they won't.
With China Central here. This is the issue with China Central Television. You just mentioned the participation of the Western countries in this conflict. We know that the biggest dealer here is actually the United States, who passed several packages to send weapons to Ukraine. Even the foreign policy of the U.S. said that U.S. politicians now they're trying to play the long game. What do you think is the intention of the United States, and is Russia ready for a long game with the United States in Ukraine?
Well, the Ukrainian game has been ongoing for quite some time now. I would recall that back in 2003, when the latest elections were held in Ukraine, the preparations were underway at the time. Western politicians, officials, the Minister for Foreign Ministers, including the Belgian Foreign Minister, I remember this perfectly well. He explicitly proclaimed that Ukrainians during those elections need to determine who they were with Russia or with Europe. And this kind of a mindset, this philosophy, either them or us, hasn't disappeared, and the way that today we see the Russophobic trends, which are raging rampant throughout Europe, and the Europeans and Americans are trying to bring the whole world into this disgraceful policy, the actions of the West at the moment, when immediately, as Russian regular Russophobia was encouraged and the Russian language prohibited. This is racism, which apparently didn't disappear. It's no longer latent. It is now obvious, and this is being spread and proliferating. The same with those slogans: Ukrainians, choose who you're with. And a few years later, there were other elections. The candidate that was not embraced by the West didn't win, and the West did everything possible to raise a wave in Ukraine and to compel its subordinate Ukrainian officials to hand over the issue to the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court, which is supposed to protect the Constitution, set out a third round of elections, which is not enshrined in the Constitution, and the necessary candidate for the United States was then selected. So, in December of 2013, there was a publication of what leaked the recording of the television, discussion between Victoria Nuland and the American ambassador in Kiev. The American ambassador in Kiev was being reported to, this was back in December, about reporting which politicians need to be prepared for the new government, even though there was more than a year before the elections, so a certain likelihood of an abnormal transfer of power was possible, and Nuland named a few names which he thought had to be included in the leadership of Ukraine. And to this, the U.S. ambassador in Kiev said, well, you know, this specific individual, he is not supported by the European Union. Do you remember what she answered? Fuck the EU. So this is the relationship. This is the truth. And the relationship today is the same. The whole coup, the turnaround with Germany, France, and Poland signed on, their ministers signed on to a guarantee of the creation of a government of national unity, which would deal with preparations for early elections in 5 to 6 months. During those elections, the opposition would certainly have won. But instead of complying with the agreement, and at least respecting the authority of European countries who placed their authority at stake, the following morning, they didn't wait very long. The next morning, they seized administrative buildings, and then at the square, they proclaimed, "Celebrate, congratulate us! We created a government of victors, not of national unity, but a government of victors." There's a big difference here, and this was something that was seen repeatedly. The fact that the United States views the current situation around Ukraine as some kind of a yardstick by which their capacity will be measured to remain a hegemon, this is absolutely clear to me. I'm not comparing the situations. However, when the United States launched their aggressive misadventures in Yugoslavia, in Iraq, in Libya, when they invaded Syria without any right to do so, and in Afghanistan, by the way, also, they announced areas of their interest in areas tens of thousands of miles from American shores. And in parallel with these processes, when they sowed chaos everywhere to then have the American fished out of those muddy waters, they advanced NATO eastward, and further eastward. NATO, a defensive alliance. When the Soviet Union existed, when there was a Warsaw Pact, when the Berlin Wall was up, a concrete wall and an imagined wall between the two blocks, yes, it was understood that they were defensive. They were defending themselves from, as they viewed the aggressive Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. But then there's no longer a Soviet Union, no Warsaw Pact, and they're now defending themselves tens of thousands of kilometers from the line that was then understood. They simply decide, okay, we will defend ourselves here, then we will defend ourselves there. They announced that NATO, now as a defensive alliance, is accountable for security in the Indo-Pacific region, as they put it. So the next line of defense of NATO, the line of protection, will be the South China Sea. I have no doubt about that. Today I spoke about this during the general debate. How long will this situation go on? I won't guess. President was asked, and the response was, we see our purposes which were proclaimed. We are working towards the achievement of those goals.
We have a new meme on TikTok. Please.
New what?
A new meme.
Да, уже?
Yeah. EU, something about EU and sex. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Lavrov. Michelle Nichols with Reuters. We've heard Russia's explanation for its invasion of Ukraine, but could you tell us what the end game is? Is the end game to overthrow the government in Kyiv? And how much pressure is Russia coming under from China to end this war?
The goals of the operation have been set in President Putin's statement on the 24th of February. We cannot tolerate. Tell me, for example, and I try to allude to some of the things which are absolutely intolerable. If imagine for a second, Reuters, right? If Ireland prohibited English in schools, in communications, in movie theaters, or if Belgium did the same to the French language, or Finland to the Swedish. Can you imagine any of these developments? I can't. But it would have been considered outrageous immediately. And there would have been a scandal and action, I have no slightest doubt, not to allow this to happen. But in case of Ukraine, for long, long years, the policy to eliminate anything Russian never drew any attention from media outlets in the West. And not only media outlets. We have been presenting these cases and calling for some action in OSCE, Council of Europe, United Nations, in relations between Russia and NATO, which at that time existed, in our contacts with the European Union, zero. Just like in the previous decades, after the Soviet Union disappeared, our insistence that European Union must end discrimination of Russians in Latvia and Estonia were not heeded at all. Absolutely. We have very deep conviction that our Western neighbors have racist instincts vis-à-vis Russia as a country, Russia as a nation. If you have any fact which will disprove what I am just saying about discrimination of Russians in Estonia, Latvia, and in Ukraine, where legislation was passed prohibiting everything, then of course we can discuss what analysis you might offer. So you call it aggression, you call it annexation. You're right. My answer is very simple. Don't try to judge from your office or from New York. Go to Crimea, talk to the people. Nobody does it except some brave politicians who are not in the elite, systemically. Go to the east. Anybody of you, did you go to Donbass during the 8 years of the war, when the Minsk agreements were raped every day? No. The Russian TV was broadcasting the situation on the Donbass side of the line of contact daily, live. And the damage to the civilian infrastructure, the killings of the peaceful population, was broadcast regularly. And we have been asking a question. Why don't Western journalists do the same on the Ukrainian, on the Ukrainian side of the line of contact? Because on the Ukrainian side of the line of contact, the damage was inflicted only by return fire. And it would be seen immediately. So I understand that you want to ask a question which would allow you then to write that I could not answer your question, but I think...
I'm after what's the military end game. We understand your
I was just asked by our Chinese friend about the military end game and the goals of the operation. You should read Putin more often and carefully. He announced everything on the 24th of February. Read it and you will get it.
And what about China? Pressure from China to end the war?
This I don't understand at all.
Your president said last week that President Xi had raised concerns about the war with President Putin.
Did he say pressure from China?
He said
did he say pressure from China?
He said concerns. So
no.
I'm asking you.
Yes or no? Did he say pressure from China?
I'm asking you though, are you coming under any pressure? I don't know. I'm asking you.
No. You asked me what about how do we feel under pressure from China? Look, let's be honest.
Are you coming under any pressure from China?
Look, you may tell your readers, listeners, viewers that I avoided to answer your question.
Mic to microphone.
You mean you don't understand Russian?
Still.